Uncle Brendan Dougherty of Business Insider here on the latest episode of Washington Squares. And I have on Corey Robin, author of The Reactionary Mind. And Corey, why don't you give us a little bit more background on you, and then I'd love to talk more about this book.
Great. I teach political science at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and I also blog at corey.robin.com.
Yeah. And so let me see if I can... First of all, I want to say that The Reactionary Mind is a great book, and I think everyone who's kind of interested in the history of conservative ideas should read it. And I enjoyed it very much, even though I think a lot of conservatives and even a lot of liberals have quibbled with even some of its basic premises. So let me see, Corey, if I can sum up a little bit of your argument and you can clarify if I've misstated anything. Which is, so your argument is that conservative, reactionary, counter-revolutionary ideas spring up against a left-wing force or an emancipatory force. That is, when the lower orders of society begin rising up to demand some kind of power, that's when conservatism or reactionary thought launches. And that it's not a pure defense. It's never a pure defense of just an old system or the status quo. Usually it's conservatism and reactionary thought is enlivened by the left's emancipatory movements to not only defend the privileges, but almost to revivify them or enhance them in the old order. Am I misstating anything there?
No, that's pretty accurate.
And you also say that in a lot of ways, what's interesting is you are always saying that conservative ideas are subtle and complex, and yet at the same time, though, it does feel like you're arguing a very simple point, which is that conservative ideas are just this simple, or are this just flexible reaction to the lower orders demanding power. I mean, that seems like a pretty simple concept, and not a very subtle one. So I almost want you to defend conservatism's subtleness.
Well, because I think the second part of the task, which you stated, but you're sort of glossing over, is where the complexity comes, which is when you're defending a old order of hierarchy and privilege, in the absence of a challenge to that order, it's not necessarily that complicated a task. In fact, people like Karl Mannheim and others have said, in fact, when there is no challenge, you're not defending the order at all. It just is. Mm-hmm. What becomes extremely complicated is that you're defending, when you're trying to defend that order, when it's under siege.
Right.
And the reason why it's so complicated is not just merely the fact that it's under siege. There's something about the siege itself that challenges the basic premise of that order.
Right.
And that is, part of the defense of the old order always is that we are the ones who are most entitled to rule. We, the powerful. We are either the most virtuous, we are the most talented, we're the most skilled, we were put here through some legitimate process, whatever it might be.
Right.
Right. And the fact that it's under such challenge at that moment completely calls into question the justification of that old order in and of itself. And I think that's that poses a legitimation crisis that is extraordinarily complicated, and the conservatives who then have to meet that challenge, okay, how are we now going to justify this order? And the ones who I think are the most far-reaching and the most interesting are very aware of that challenge. And what they oftentimes come to, or what I should say is that the first premise of their project is the the traditional justifications, the traditional defenses don't work anymore. We can't fall back on them. We can't rely upon them. We have to come up with a new one. And it has to be, and this is, I think, a second part of what makes it so complex and subtle, it has to be a challenge that in some way, shape, or form is going to resonate and make sense to at least some part of the population that might be sympathetic to the challenge. In other words, you can't come up with a defense of an old regime that's appealing merely to the people at the very top of that old regime. It just doesn't work.
Right.
You have to have come up with a defense that is at least going to resonate with some part of the people who, at least in theory, are ready to join up with the insurgency. And I think that is an extraordinarily complicated task. And there's just one other thing, and then I'll stop, which is that, remember, these whole process is happening in the modern era. And, we can argue about what defines modernity and all the rest of it, but one conventional aspect of modernity is that the kind of medieval and ancient, great chain of being argument, whereby, as you know, the sort of the hierarchies of power that are in the world themselves, in the state, mirror the sort of larger cosmologies of power that extend from God, downward. Those types of arguments are much, much more fragile. I mean, it's not that they don't exist and aren't available, but they're much, much more difficult to come by when, the sort of the metaphysics of modernity has really called all of that into question. And that process begins very early in modern history. It's not, Einstein and relativity. We're talking, going back to Descartes. So I think that's the second challenge is that, a lot of modern theorists who are conservative operate in a world where that kind of medieval or ancient cosmology of power and metaphysics of power is no longer available to them.
That's right. I think this is also why I have had such a personal and complicated reaction to your book. Because I actually have not settled on some of these bigger questions myself. Whether I'm a modernist or medieval, really. And it's...
Although, let me just point out, the very fact that it's a question that you're deliberating and you have not settled on.
It makes me a modern.
It makes you a modern, exactly.
Right. I've said this, it's funny, I'll try to make this, try to give a personal example of this in life as it's lived. The difference between modernity and the medieval great chain of being view. So my wife and I, when we married, we chose to be married in the traditional Latin Mass that the Catholic Church offers. So, first of all, we just chose this. We asked for it. That's actually in itself modern in that this would just be handed to you in a pre-modern society. Not only that, but it was, even though we were trying to express some kind of submission to authority of the church in this regard, it literally comes out, the actual dramaturgy of this liturgy, most people receive it as, oh, that's what Michael and his wife think about marriage. They didn't take it as, oh, this is the church telling us what marriage is. Right. So that's the difference between modernity and the kind of medieval period. And I agree that this is like the great intellectual crisis for conservatives constantly.
Right.
As for myself, I theologically I'm still a Catholic, but I am stuck with this modern problem.
Right.
And in politics, it's funny, you talk constantly about the right learning from or borrowing or appropriating from the revolutions they're trying to stop. And I can't tell if this is a profound observation or like an obvious one. So like you talk about how, the pamphleteers come out and then all of a sudden churchmen are organizing essay contests to try to appeal to the same people with pamphlets instead of writing kind of high elite theology. Or you can multiply 1,000 examples. And one thing I was thinking is that in one way I can't tell if you're describing conservatism or something kind of ecological in human nature, where so Chesterton says, if you want a white post, you can't just do nothing and let the white post sit there,
right,
because over time it becomes a black post. You have to clean it, you have to repaint it, so sometimes I wondered, occasionally in your book you mention a category, sometimes you refer to thoughtful traditionalists as opposed to conservatives and reactionaries. And I was wondering, who are these thoughtful traditionalists, and are they people that just watch the white post become black, right, and say, oh, well, this is an organic process that's just happening,
right,
and I don't judge the content of anything that's happening, I just receive it.
Right.
So is there such a thing as a thoughtful traditionalist, or are we all kind of engaged in this modern battle?
Mm-hmm. Well, two things. I want to first come back to what you're talking about yourself, because as I was listening to you describe about getting married with the Latin Mass and all the rest of it, what really jumped into my mind was Justice Scalia, who I write about in the chapter, and your account of your own marriage and your life is actually very similar to his own biography. I mean, people think of him as this sort of arch-traditional Catholic who inherits this liturgy and this practice from his parents and from their parents and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, if you read him carefully and the biography and what he says, it's very much of an invented tradition that began with him. His mother, in fact, constantly complained, why is it that we have to drive hours and hours to church? Don't you guys have your local neighborhood church? Well, they did have their local neighborhood church, but they didn't want to go there because it was, kind of a Vatican II type church. Whereas you say, a long time ago, you would have just gone to your local church, and that would have been the end of it. You may have liked it, you put up with it. That becomes part of the architecture of your being. Is that relationship you have to what's there? But in the modern world, and Scalia was very clear that he saw this as a kind of counterculture in the '60s, where he was raising his own children, as a kind of not a local platoon, a little platoon, but a kind of Thoreauvian retreat from the modern world. And so I think what you're describing is not atypical.
Right. And I think you're nailing it, and that mirrors my own self-conception and views as well.
Right.
Right. And that I don't... And it's interesting because I was reading your book, and I'm willing, I hate the way your book has been criticized for mixing the categories of conservative, reactionary, and counter-revolutionary.
I hate it too.
Partly because I've been willing to be labeled any of those things. But at the same time, most of the thinkers you talk about were not the ones that were important to me. And I think that's just an accident of history.
So who was important to you, just out of...
Well, that's where it gets interesting, and that's where we can go a little deeper. So you talk about how the right appropriates from the left. And one thinker that has been important to me is James Burnham. And James Burnham was a communist who gradually came over to the right, became a senior editor at National Review. And his theory was a class-based theory, right out of Marxism, where he believed that, instead of an inevitable proletarian revolution that dethrones capital, what instead we're experiencing is a managerial class rising to power and inserting itself, in a sense, in between capital, which it uses, and labor, which it takes advantage of. And that was rather important to me. Mm-hmm. Similarly, one of the thinkers that he influenced, a kind of polemical writer in the 1990s, Samuel Francis, who eventually became a kind of racialist thinker. Yeah. But when Francis was writing about Burnham, he kept saying that conservatism has nothing to teach us about strategy. that the revolution has already occurred, and so we have to be this counter-revolutionary force, and so we should look to Antonio Gramsci for strategy on how to overcome the forces in the society that oppose us. And that, and also Burnham looks to the Italian realists, who kind of themselves look at politics of the elite as always being necessarily a kind of force and fraud, with myths that justify their power. And I partly believe in that. And then on the other side, I've been influenced by the Catholic distributists like Chesterton and Belloc, who hated at the beginning of the 20th century the concentration of wealth that industrialism was bringing. So, and it's very interesting. So, and in some ways, even though I'm willing to say I'm a conservative in the current political context, I suppose I can imagine myself in different ages being a liberal or being a radical. When you describe, I think in some of the interviews you've done since you've done the book, you've described how conservatism is really succeeding in the economic sphere in creating these huge gaps of wealth and power. And to me, I feel like completely indifferent to major corporations like Vivendi or Coca-Cola or IBM or Apple. I don't view them as something that conservatives need to necessarily defend. But you also talk about that. I mean, it's interesting the way you weave together the libertarian and the anti-capitalist, and the monarchist versus the right-wing Democrat or fascist, and try to tie them together. So, sorry, that's a little bit of my own intellectual background.
Yeah.
But so I'm someone that's not attached to conservatism as a kind of eternal principle in itself, and that's why I do identify as maybe Scalia does with this sort of cavalier style of counterculturalism that's on the right. But there's another aspect to your book which, pretty much the second half of it is dedicated to the role of violence in conservative thought. Why don't you explain that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I'll tell it sort of backwards. I became interested in conservatism really by accident. I was writing a magazine piece about a couple of conservatives who were moving to the left after the Cold War. And in the course of that article, I discovered a kind of a strong stream of romanticism, which has always been in conservatism. There's nothing new about that. But what I was surprised by was its continuation, that its persistence. And people like Irving, and we're not talking about outliers, we're talking about people like Irving Kristol, William F. Buckley, and so forth. And it was a romanticism that made them very, leery of the market, not opposed to it by any stretch. They didn't want to abolish it, but certainly not champions of it. And also very infatuated, engaged, galvanized by the Cold War and by what it represented as a struggle. And there was a real sense of sadness, and loss. There's just no other way to describe it at the end of the Cold War. I mean, Irving Kristol just looked at me straight and said, I've been lost since the end of the Cold War, and this is why in recent years he said, this was before he died, obviously, I haven't been writing that much. I just, I've sort of lost my way. And, when I first heard that, I thought it was interesting, and I talk about it. It's a chapter in the book. And I just thought, well, that's that. Then 9/11 happened, and the war in Iraq. And what was amazing to me was you heard, and this was not from the radical left, but from people in the very mainstream right, like David Brooks, Bill Kristol, Irving's son, welcoming 9/11 as a real deliverance from what they saw as the decadence of the 1990s, the Clinton years. And part of the decadence was the fact that we were, just engaged in our consumer capitalist pursuits. And again, we're talking about David Brooks. We're not talking, Chesterton Juniors, or something like that.
Right. No, I agree. I totally agree with the distinction there.
So, and this was a very loud part of the argument. You saw also people like the Kagan, the whole Kagan family, was talking about this kind of thing. What's his name? The British historian who's a big deal over here. Not Neil Ferguson.
No, Ferguson, yeah.
And so it was a real part of the argument, and it seemed to me, and I got a lot of flack for this when I made this case, and I got a lot of flack from the left, that a good part of what the Iraq War was all about was this kind of rejuvenating war against the cultural decadence of America. So that's where I was coming from, and this was 2003, 2004. And at the same time, I began teaching a lot of conservative writing, going back to Burke, and discovering a very similar argument about the rejuvenating force of warfare amongst conservatives. And what I do in the book is that ultimately I really trace this back to an early essay by Burke on a philosophical inquiry into our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. I think that's the exact title. It's a long title. But anyway, the sublime and the beautiful, where he really lays out, I think, quite clearly the moral psychology that would underlie this point of view. And that is, just to simplify, that in the ordinary course of our lives, when we are enjoying our sort of creatured comforts, there is a kind of tendency towards depression, melancholy, and death. That, in other words, when we are too assured of our creature comforts, when our lives are too pleasurable, too easy, we are on a slow road towards death, if not suicide. And that's the argument of the sublime and the beautiful, and that the counter to that, says Burke, is the sublime, which is aroused by experiences of terror and danger. And so from that argument, I construct a kind of an account of why violence has been so important on the right. Now, I just want to make two caveats, and then I'll stop. The one is that this is not a claim that conservatives are personally motivated by the thrill of violence. I try to make it very clear, both in the book and also elsewhere when I've talked about this. I have no idea what's in anybody's heart of hearts, and I tend to assume that the sort of bloodlust is a sort of universal feature of the human condition. Nobody is exempt from it, not the left or the right. I'm very leery of arguments that try to find a kind of conservative, a conservative psyche, as it were. I don't believe that. I do think it's a conservative argument, and that's a very different account. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I just want to quickly say is that the left has, it's not that the left doesn't have its own discourse on violence. It does. It's a very strong and powerful discourse, but it's not the same as the conservative discourse on violence. It's not, with the possible exception of someone like Frantz Fanon, it is not, and I say possible because I think he's actually much more ambivalent on this question. On the left, you find much more of a realist discourse on violence, which is, really draws from, who are the thinkers that, Lenin was most indebted to Clausewitz. Yes. Gramsci was most indebted to Machiavelli. So for these writers, it's a realist discourse of violence, and I think there's a reason for that, which is that realism is an economizing logic. It says, how do you maximize the resources that you have? And when the left is in an insurgent position, it doesn't have any resources. It has to maximize the little bit of violence, the few instruments of violence that it has. So that's why with guerrilla armies, for instance, there's a real emphasis on scarcity. You don't want to, use up your bullets. And it's even why in leftist discourses on terrorism, so the anarchists, let's say, right? It's all about the propaganda of the deed, because you're trying to make a little act, an assassination, go a long, long way. So again, I think there's an economizing scarcity argument that the left is indebted to when it comes to violence. The right is coming from an opposite position. It's It's the plethora of power and the instruments of violence that you have at your disposal, which is really the problem that needs to be overcome.
Right. Right, that's right. And I think, I do think that's right. Although, I want to bring up, obviously there's some residual conservative in me that wants to say, what about the Soviet Union and the purges and, and things like that. But
again, just to say, this is not a claim that the left doesn't engage in, spectacular and cataclysmic forms of violence. But I don't think you find the same kind of, it's the arguments that accompany those, I think, are quite different. That's all.
No, I agree. And it's funny, I recognize this, and it's very funny when we talk about centering this back in the 1990s conservative discourse about American decadence. It's funny because the 90s, it was the intervention in the Balkans that actually made me kind of politically aware as a young man, and opposing that from the right. As this kind of, I saw it as this threat of this global political class that was going to essentially dictate the destruction of nationhood itself. It was a little bit, in my mind at the time, it was quite cataclysmic. And then at 9/11 and after 9/11, I was still in this tradition of anti-war conservatism on the right. And it is funny, though. I mean, so you've admitted that or you write that Scalia and maybe even myself, to some degree, have this idea of almost countercultural right-wingism or reactionary views. I was at the American Conservative where we were defined by our opposition to the Iraq War. And I'm trying to understand, I suppose, what private hierarchies of power I would be trying to defend. I suppose the church, marriage, or traditional marriage or other things would be among them. But I don't feel particularly powerful in my views, or that they have a lot of power in our discourse. It seems to me, like psychologically, like I am a rebel. That my views are not approved by the prevailing structure of taboos and by the enormous corporations that control the media. So there's that instinct where I feel like perhaps I'm fighting for survival if I'm fighting at all. So in a sense, I'm wondering. For some of us on the right, I'm wondering, is there anything conservative about us at all? I mean...
Well, there's a couple of things I would say. One, I think the question of capitalism on the right is a complicated one, and as you are part of a long tradition that is leery of...
I would just say skeptical.
Of capitalism for a variety of reasons, usually for cultural reasons. But there's other arguments that conservatives have made, and I try to, I really actually try to honor that in the book. I talk a lot about that tradition. But I think it's in some ways it's a sort of a misnomer, and it's symptomatic of the poverty of our discussion today. That somebody would, that we could say, well, I'm against, corporations, therefore how can I fit on the right? Because what I try to make the case is that what the left stands for, it's not that the left is anti-capitalist, although it certainly has been. That's not the critical point from the point of view of the right. The critical point is the toppling of these private hierarchies, and I focus in particular when it comes to capitalism and the economy on the workplace. That conservatism has really, and this is much, this is quite true of the conservative movement as a whole. I don't know where you stand personally on this, but that, the major thing that the modern conservative movement opposed in the New Deal. The thing that was the most galvanizing was not, regulation, the SEC. It wasn't regulation of the economy in general. In fact, many corporations were okay with that, or some of them at least were. It was really the intrusion into the workplace, the private hierarchy, through the National Labor Relations Act, through the creation of unions. Then that was an incredibly, and I think we just have no sense of this, in part because our whole sense of what labor is all about in this country is so muted these days. But, it was really the kind of a toppling of these private hierarchies in the workplace, from the online supervisor all the way up to the owner. That was really what was most important to the creation of the modern conservative movement in the New Deal, and then it added other things as well with the civil rights movement and the feminist movement and so forth. So I think that's that doesn't answer your question about what what power you personally are defending, but I think it gets a little bit at how some conservatives could be, like Irving Kristol, leery of the free market, but not at all willing, and in fact in favor of supporting certain kind of redistributive measures. Like the welfare state. Kristol was somewhat, okay with that, and thought it was ridiculous that people were arguing about the prescription,
drug act in the before September 11th.
The Bush bill.
Yeah, he thought it was totally beneath a great empire to be
exactly. So the whole sort of obsessive focus on money and nickel and diming, somebody of that persuasion on the right would be unseemly. It's not it's not, as he said, it's not Rome, it's not Athens, it's not the British Empire. But when it comes though to the actual control in the workplace and the kind of hierarchies, I think there's very little discussion of that. And in fact, on the right, there's, you pretty much favor it because it's in support of some kind of a hierarchical notion of society. And even libertarians, who seem to have not a hierarchical bone in their body, at least at the level of their ideology. And there are some libertarians now, they call themselves bleeding heart libertarians, who favor certain kinds of state redistribution, where it really stops on the question of labor unions and empowerment at the level of the workplace. It's just something they will not touch at all.
I thought this was one of the most interesting parts of your book. And I hate to be flattering you so much. I feel like I'm supposed to be attacking you.
Go ahead. It's so rare these days with this book, so.
But, no, you talked about in the 20th century in the workplace, but you also talked about in the 19th century how emancipation of slavery was this threat to the kind of the intimate relationships between masters and slaves, and how close to home that these things hit. That what conservatives really in the South and in the 20th century, what they really opposed was the politicizing of what they viewed as this intimate, natural, private hierarchy that was meaningful to them. That they found meaning in these things. In these roles, and sometimes it could be over romanticized. I think, especially the slave example, but I could be wrong. And I have to say, I actually do resist, even though I hate I think that the concentration of wealth that we have in our society right now is corrosive. I mean, I'm not a thoroughgoing economic egalitarian. I don't think everyone should have the same income or something like that. But I do think that wild concentration of wealth we've seen in the last century and a half, 2 centuries, is dangerous and corrosive. But there is something in me that objects to the less insistence on introducing politics into every private sphere. And it's something so deep in my bones that, why this contract, this almost fetish for contractual relationships that where everyone is asserting rights against one another constantly. That's my view of it. And like I said, I don't feel like I'm a super powerful guy. I mean, I admit privilege of all sorts, having been educated and being white in a multiracial society that still has a history of racism. I'm willing to cop to every bit of that. But yeah, I do resist the left's intrusion in this way. I wish that there was another ethic or set of social stigmas that could be introduced to curb the abuses that I think the left is justly trying to address. And in fact, maybe that's where a sign of conservatism's exhaustion right now is that I can't even begin to articulate what those might be. But yeah, I do. I found that part of your book very challenging because I did recognize that yes, that these spheres are precious to me, and it is interesting too. Obviously I'm Catholic, and I'm constantly thinking about the state of the church and the lack of authority in it, and its kind of enervation over the last century. And that same dialogue you talk about renewal and revolution exists so palpably in the church in the past century. All of my traditionalist friends that oppose some sort of reforms that were at Vatican II or afterward, there is not a single one of them that will defend the church of the 1940s and 50s. None of them. They all said this was coming. It was on the horizon. They could see it, and they didn't prepare. And part of me just thinks that this is something that's partly hardwired into human nature. I mean, you see it over and over again that some regime or some supposed golden era of power turns out to be incredibly weak or corrupted from within. It topples over immediately, but there were people during the golden age saying, this is wrong, there's people are enjoying the privileges of these institutions, but none of the principle. They're.
And I think that's a critical point. I couldn't agree with you more. And this is why, when you and I were on that show with Chris Hayes, I'm up with Chris Hayes, and with that other guy, I can't remember his name, but he works with David Frum.
Right.
He was saying, well, look, we over at from Forum, we're making an argument that the Republican Party needs to modernize, it needs to change, and so forth. So, you can't say that we're all reactionaries and all the rest of it. And I actually thought it proved my point in the same way what you just said proves it, which is there will be voices in the waning days of an old regime. There were certainly in the Ancien regime voices of warning that, we need to fix this. And they tend to get ignored. And they don't have much traction because, the more dominant powers, don't quite believe it, or are, indifferent, or are kind of going down with the ship. I don't know what it might be. And it's only after the revolution comes, in the case of France, or the New Deal comes, or the feminist movement, that then you see the real intellectual ferment where we began this discussion with on the right, the complexity, because then there's really an opportunity to say, you people got us here. We haven't talked about this, but it's a very important part of my argument that I think the major immediate target on the right, the immediate enemy, is never the revolution. It is the old regime itself and its defenders. And from Burke to de Maistre up through the neocons of the last however many decades, you see the same argument over and over and over again, which is you people, meaning you wealthy, powerful, privileged people, you got us into this mess. Because you were so self-interested, short-term, complacent, and selfish. You got us here,
And there's so many ironies to this as well, because at one point you used the image of the conservative movement that used to be a cocktail party in Darien, Connecticut. And I always think of the WASPs of Darien, Connecticut. And it is amazing to see, like, the WASP culture of Connecticut, which used to have so much power over the nation, over an enormous nation like the United States. And in a sense, it was so funny that the champion of the conservative movement in the middle of the last century was this Catholic born in Mexico who affected the style, an exaggerated WASP style, like Buckley did. While WASPs were busy, enjoying their wealth, which in many cases is dwarfed by the new wealth in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street. But they enjoyed their privileges, and many of them just simply are, culturally with the revolution itself. They join environmental causes. They join causes for, and humanitarianism, exactly. And birth control is a big one, and that's one where I can imagine. There could have been some alternate history, right, where the Kennedys made the Democratic Party a kind of throne, or not throne, but a Tammany Hall and altar party, and the Republican Party could have been money and family planning. Somehow that didn't happen. The Bushes could have made it money.
Well, it was for a time, actually.
It was, yeah, exactly. But yeah, there. So you had this, and then of course, it's funny too. People would even say sometimes David Brooks wishes he could be a WASP himself, and you have this this quality that from Disraeli to Buckley, and maybe even Sarah Palin. And I know you've gotten so much flack for including her in this discourse of just people who arrived on the scene late to a party that they maybe even didn't know they wanted to join.
It is, I don't think I've really kind of figured this out, to be honest with you. I mean, it continues to be something really fascinating to me, this kind of countercultural, oppositional rebel, as you said, sensibility on the right that, again, you could go back to Burke and find it, in his letter to a noble lord, where he takes on. It's interesting. He had been denounced, for taking I think it was a pension, and one of the people leading the denunciation was this, what we would call a kind of, limousine liberal of his time, who was, kind of dabbling with the French Revolution, but was very much to the manner born. And Burke just lays into him with such rage, because Burke himself was, from a long Catholic family. His father had converted to Anglicanism, but popery was the rumor around him all the time, and he was Irish, and he wasn't aristocratic. And he says, as only Burke can say it, at every turnpike, I think is the phrase, you ask me for my passport, demanding that I prove that I'm one of you. And, nobody gave this to me. I worked for it, And so there's such contempt, there's such rage in Burke against the Darien, Connecticut's set of his day. And I think you don't understand the right if you don't understand that.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's interesting because, like you said, as we've said the whole time, it comes from this pressure of challenge. Because ultimately, I may never have been part of the war party, and I've always identified more with, Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement than Franco's Spain or something like that. But there is this horrible and I think excruciating tension in the conservative mind between asserting, on the one hand, this dire need to defend an old order or an old principle that's under assault, but then also this romanticism about bourgeois values, which you see from Oakeshott and his kind of, you use this beautiful turn of phrase about like the warming fire that he's sitting next to or something like that. And even the neoconservatives in the 70s, talked about these bourgeois values as, and even though that bourgeois society has these incredibly small virtues, like prudence or frugality or something like that, that those were worth defending. But at the same time, right, so for me, the symbols of the little platoons I want to defend, high school baseball games and, the single-family home or something like that, that resonate in my mind as these are the things I wanted to defend. At the same time, the pressure of revolution does breed this kind of contempt for the people that are actually enjoying those things.
Absolutely.
I don't know if it's escapable for the conservative. I don't think there is a pure balancing act, because on the one hand we say, well, we want, I would say I want people to have these traditions that I have from my church, that we have taken from the early church fathers, the medievals, etc. And I want them in that neighborhood church where this is handed to them and received. But at the same time, I look at most of the people who are just taking what's handed to them by the church, and I'm thinking like, no, you have to actually grasp this and believe it and apprehend it yourself, and seize it with like a holiness and fervor. That's what's needed in this age.
And I think this is something that I tried to sort of touch on, and wished I had kind of been able to bring out a bit more. I think in the end it's the second point of view that really is the deepest current on the right, which is a feeling that in the end, it comes out of the counter-revolutionary discourse of the right, in the sense that, we have to have a more vital, more vibrant, more sort of insurgent sensibility, agonistic, and from a tactical point of view. But I think in the end, and I allude to this very briefly in the introduction to the book, I think there is a kind of utopia at the heart of that vision that the right comes to, which is that it's not merely tactical in the end, that it really is the idea of the good society, is one in which people have to struggle to attain whatever it is that they have. And I think this is something that really does, this is how I read, for instance, libertarianism, which is that going back to Burke, there was a real sense that, if you're going to have a real ruling class, it's going to have to, it can't really be an inherited class. It has to be one who have, as you said, wrested their privileges, because otherwise it's not going to be muscular enough. And there's always been that sense from the very beginning. And I think, the one sphere that the right has thought that you could achieve that is on the battlefield, right? Because in warfare, it really is just, you with your wit and your weapon, or at least in a certain kind of romanticism of warfare. The reality is quite different, of course. But you have that on the one hand, but I think with time, and it really gets going in the mid-19th century, late 19th century, the marketplace really becomes a sphere in which you forced your way in through your virtue, through your talent, through your skill. And I think that's where the right begins to really, particularly in Europe, which had been skeptical of the market and of bourgeois capitalism, really begins to see in it a kind of proving ground of greatness where you really test your mettle. And I think someone like Schumpeter and then Hayek and von Mises really are critical in this regard, and that's how I see libertarianism ultimately is the fulfillment of that vision. But I do think you're right that this is a real tension between a vision of sort of inherited virtue versus acquired one. I tend to think in the end that the right sides with the acquisition of virtue, because it believes it's a truer kind of virtue. It's a more powerful and vital one.
Right, and in a true sense too, the ultimate. There is a way to reconcile these, I think, theologically, although I don't think there's one in politics or in history. But I also think that this tension between the assigned and the earned merit, it may also explain a little bit the conservative fascination with the military itself, even partly apart from warfare. I mean, if you look at a film, it's almost perfect, a film like Master and Commander, where I think the New York Times critic said it could have been penned by Edmund Burke, the screenplay, because the big task for almost everyone in that film is to somehow earn the role that they've been assigned already. So you have one young officer who is cowardly and indecisive, and eventually he just kills himself. I mean, but then you have these others who maybe were high-born, privileged. That's why they're a young officer on Her Majesty's ship. But they don't find true meaning until the battle has taught them that they did deserve this all along. And so in that way, it's almost like the perfect dramatization, I think, of what you get at in this. Well,
the other one I would think about in this regard is Frank Meyer, who was not a name most people know about, even on the right, but he was really one of the intellectual political architects of what was called the fusion strategy, how to bring together the libertarian free market wing of the right with the cultural traditionalist, social traditionalist wing of the right. And he was himself, the way he formulates the argument, I think, is very close to what you're talking about, which is we want real believers, in the virtues, in religion and all the rest of it. But to be real, it has to be freely chosen. It can't be forced. It can't be just inherited. It has to be elected. It has to be elected. And I think, this was a kind of tactical argument he came up with in order to justify the fusion of these two wings of the conservative movement. But I think it actually gets at a much deeper truth on the right, which is that, we want people have to really be worthy, not just of their beliefs, but of their privileges, their powers, and not in a kind of liberal meritocratic way, right? This is not, Nick Lehman's, SATs that sort of level the playing field at all, because that's just too anodyne. It's just a test. It's scientific. It's not, it's not really proving your mettle. And I think there's this desire for people to really prove, their mettle, and the way you do that is by overcoming constraints. And I think that in the end, that's the real fear on the right of a world without constraint. It's not just simply that it's not anarchy, actually. It's not anarchy. It's easiness. And I think this is something that speaks to the kind of countercultural sensibility that you've been talking about in your own life, in Scalia, and I think it also speaks to libertarians as well, or at least I would say a good part of libertarians, which is this notion that if you get something without having to give something up for it, your blood, your sweat, your tears, if you're on the kind of more romantic wing of the right, or your labor, or your money, whatever it might be. If you don't give it up, if you don't give something up, you can't really say it has real value. And I put it that way because I'm really reading a lot of these marginalist Austrian economics types, and that really is at the heart, I think, of the moral vision of money and exchange for them. There is a kind of Burkean romance about it, which is that you don't know the worth of anything until you're willing to give up your last penny for it, and that is where value lies. And
it's true too, and it actually speaks to my own psychology, maybe why I identify with the right, is that at some point I developed a sense of just absolute resentment at a political culture in which the main participants seem to view themselves as foreordained by simply their education, their values, to rule, and that I think a lot of those values were easy, and a lot of that education was easy, and it does give my own and much of the conservative movement's politics this populist verve, is that, well, we hate this rationalized, a privilege that's entirely rationalized, whereas you're talking about something different on the right, where we want something earned and romantic. It is a different idea of privilege and merit. I think we should leave it right there. I think we've gone on long enough, but I'd love to pick it up some other time, I think. Thank you, Corey, for coming on and for writing this book. It is challenging. I've probably given on an impression that I agree with everything in it. I have my quibbles here or there, but it is really valuable. I wish more conservatives would engage it, and I wish you great success in promoting it.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed talking with you about it.
Great. Thank you, Corey. We'll do it again soon. Bye-bye.